Well, I think we'll begin. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Delighted to see you all here. My name is John Efron, and I'm the director of the Center for Jewish Studies here at UC Berkeley. And I would like to welcome you to this year's annual Pell Lecture, and begin by expressing our gratitude to the Ida and Joseph Pell Foundation for its long-standing and generous support. It gives me enormous pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Michael Brenner, the dearest of friends and one of the world's leading authorities in the field of modern Jewish history. Michael is the Seymour and Lillian Abensohn Chair in Israel Studies and Director of the Center for Israel Studies at American University in Washington. He also holds the Chair of Jewish History and Culture at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. Professor Brenner is also one of the most highly decorated scholars in our field. In 2020, he was awarded the Salo W. and Jeanette M. Baron Award for Scholarly Excellence in Research on the Jewish Experience. He was also awarded the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany in 2014, just 1 year after he had been appointed as International President of the Leo Baeck Institute, the world's leading repository for the study of German-speaking Jewry. It's a position he still holds. And about one more honor, it was one of the most joyous moments of my life to have been present in Munich in 2009 when he was made a fellow of the Bavarian Academy of Arts and Sciences in a very elaborate, indeed Baroque ceremony, which included some very funny hats. And with Michael's induction, the average age of the Academy membership instantly dropped by about 25 years, which is a great testament to how meteoric a career Michael has had ever since he first stepped on to the academic stage, which incidentally was with a prize-winning book he wrote on daily life under the Nazis in Weiden, which is a small Bavarian town not far from the Czech border. And it is the place Michael was born and in whose Jewish community of mostly Holocaust survivors that he was raised. Since its appearance in 1986, Michael has written and edited scores of books and articles and op-ed pieces. I'll just mention some of the books here. The Renaissance of Jewish Culture in Weimar Germany in 1996, German Jewish History in Modern Times, the second volume, which won the National Jewish Book Award. And he was a co-author of that, won the award in 1997. Zionism, A Brief History in 2003. Prophets of the Past, Interpreters of Jewish History in 2010. And most recently, In Search of Israel, The History of an Idea in 2018. Michael's latest book appeared in 2019 in German, and it is set to appear in English with Princeton University Press very soon, and is entitled In Hitler's Munich, Jews, Antisemitism, and the Rise of the Nazis. Among other things, this most timely book is in part the story of how a once vibrant, if shaky democracy easily slipped into an anti-democratic and ultimately genocidal state, in large part because the established and so-called respectable conservative parties aided and abetted a political novice and histrionic showman to come to power, all the while thinking that they could control him. The vice-chancellor at the time, Franz von Papen, who was not a Nazi, but who helped engineer Hitler's ascent to the chancellorship, said in 1933, when he came in, now we've got him boxed into a corner. Now, it was both a stunningly naive statement and factually incorrect. Long before 1933, Hitler's conservative allies and even opponents allowed themselves to be boxed in. And one significant piece of evidence of just how little restraint Hitler faced before 1933 was that the Nazi assault on the Jews had been underway long before he had become chancellor. The geographic focus of Michael's new book is Munich after World War I, a political cauldron of left and right-wing extremes, wherein Bavaria was briefly headed, as we'll hear, by a Jewish socialist called Eisner, who was assassinated in February 1919, the same year that the Nazi Party was founded in Munich, where Hitler harped on constantly about a Judeo-Bolshevik plot to conquer Germany. Michael's choice to study that city is also motivated by the little recognized fact that it was the Munich Jewish community, specifically, that was Europe's first to come under direct assault from the Nazis. My instruction to you is to post your questions if you have them into the chat. And with that, it's my great pleasure to welcome this year's Pell Lecturer, Michael Brenner, who will speak to us on Hitler's laboratory, how Munich became the capital of anti-Semitism after World War I. So over to you.
Thank you so much, John, for not only an overly generous introduction, but also one that brings back a lot of memories. Memories of time spent together at many places, including Munich and Berkeley, of course. And thank you for the invitation. I would have loved to come. I've always loved to be in Berkeley, but at least we do so on the screen today. Let me say a few words about how this book actually came about. I started to be interested many years ago as a student still in the Jewish revolutionaries of the Munich Revolution of 1918-19. And this still is a substantial part of the book, and I will start my lecture with it. But in the process of writing the story of those fascinating people, I'll talk about them a little bit, I became more and more aware, although there's so much been written, of course, on every aspect of Hitler's rise in the early 1920s, there was really not much, or maybe even nothing, about the Jewish reactions in that very city where he came, where he tried to come to power for the first time in 1923. So with that said, I will actually share my screen for part of my presentation. I hope that that works. You can see it, I hope. And the first person I would like to draw your attention to was Kurt Eisner. Kurt Eisner, whom you see in the upper corner, was in fact the first Jewish head of state or prime minister. He called the German terminology is Ministerpräsident, so sometimes it's prime minister or governor, whatever you want to call it, but he was the first head of state in Germany of all times, and he was almost the last one in Germany also. There was only a very brief other exception, so to say. Kurt Eisner was a social democrat. In fact, before World War I, he was also a journalist. He was the editor of one of the editors of Vorwärts of the German social democratic paper, nothing to do with the Yiddish forwards. And he was considered a rather moderate social democrat. He became more maybe radical in World War I when he became a pacifist and joined the independent social democrats, the USPD, the Unabhängige Sozialdemokraten, in the middle of the war, with the endeavor to end the war. In 1918, actually on November 7th, and that was 2 days before the overthrow of the monarchy in Berlin, Bavaria, rather conservative Bavaria, was the first German state to overthrow the monarchy, drive the king out of the city, and become a republic. It's called, and it is called until this very day, the Free State of Bavaria, Freistaat Bayern. Well, drive out the king is maybe even exaggerated. There was no bloodshed on November 7th. It was a totally peaceful revolution. And I just want to read a quote from the palace administrator in Munich, who wrote down the events as follows. When the most sovereign gentleman had left the residence, the royal residence, I shut the windows in the royal palace, helped extinguish the lights, and after the officiant on duty and the footmen who had no further instructions had left, I closed all the doors and made my way to the chapel courtyard. That was the revolution in Munich. The workers' councils that had been formed before and the many soldiers that happened to be in the town, very much to Eisner's surprise, rallied after him. They were all disappointed with the monarchy and, of course, the loss of the war, but they rallied behind the most unlikely figure for Catholic Bavaria, namely a Jewish Prussian socialist and journalist, Kurt Eisner. Now, there's of course so much to say about the revolution, which I cannot do in the little time I have, but for our interest, what is really immediately visible is the anti-Semitism going along with Eisner's rise to power. So when I undertook the research on this for this book, I, of course, also went to see his Nachlass, his estate, his papers, which are in Berlin in the Bundesarchiv. And it was one of the most depressing founds in this huge collection. There were two big files with hundreds, literally hundreds of anti-Semitic letters, sometimes with very explicit drawings, hate letters against Eisner's. There include a postcard addressed to the Hebrew residents and a letter to the King of the Jews, which reads, "Control yourself or disappear to the country where you belong, to Palestine." And these are the milder ones. Of course, there are horrible terms, which I will spare you. Something that already appears in this early phase is the rumor that Eisner was not a Prussian Jew born in Berlin, but he actually was a Galician Jew, an East European Jew, whose actual name was Salomon. That was the most famous form, Salomon Kosmanowski or Koshinsky, all kinds of versions. He actually himself liked to laugh about it and make jokes about it. It was so common that he said once in the to the Council of Ministers, he said, "You know, people gave me this beautiful biblical name Solomon. I have nothing to do with this name, instead of the short and not so nice German Kurt. But unfortunately, that's not my name." And what is important is that these rumors were spread not only by the radical anti-Semites. The leaders of the church, for example, very important in Munich, Cardinal Faulhaber claimed that Eisner was a Galician Jew. So did the papal ambassador, Count Pacelli. Pacelli, of course, later became Pope Pius, and he was at the time in Munich, and he was part of this spreading this theory that Eisner was an East European Jew. Even worse, some of them claim not. It wasn't enough to be Galician. He was East Galician, so an East Galician Jew. So this was part of the from the beginning. This was part of having the first Jew as a prime minister of a German state. Anti-Semitism came along with it. Of course, Bavarian Jews realized that immediately. And while in the first moment, in November of 1918, you see in some of the Jewish papers, some kind of pride. Wow, now we're really equal citizens. We have a Jewish prime minister. A minute later, the week after, people realized, not so good for us, and we shouldn't be so exposed. And then among the files, among the letters in the estate of Eisner, you also find Jewish letter writers. For example, there was a Max Dreyfus who wrote, as he says, on behalf of several Jews from Landau to express concerns about growing anti-Semitism in the press. And he asked Eisner to make every effort at stopping, if possible, these kinds of attacks. Another one from Geroldshofen, a small place in Franconia, complained, "You are making all Jews, your co-religionists, unhappy. We Jews in Bavaria were content after all under the king." But now Eisner and his Jewish comrades were driving all of Jewry, he said, into ruin. For now, the writer continues, the charge is being brought against us everywhere. The Jew bears the blame for every misfortune. And interestingly, Eisner, who must have had a lot to do in his time as prime minister, even took the time to reply to some of those Jewish letter writers. We have one example, of course, many are lost, I'm sure, a commercial counselor, Meyer, who also said, you know, as a Jew, you shouldn't expose yourself. And Eisner replies, "Dear sir, the views you hold have emerged from the conscious or unconscious anxiety of Jews who, although they are not ready to risk their lives for a revolutionary cause, do worry that their precious lives could suffer if the failure of the revolutionary uprisings results in popular discontent being deflected against them. I am not the minister-president of Bavaria because it gives me pleasure. I will bless the day on which I no longer hold this office. But I am the creator and representative of these most wonderful of all freedom movements. And this makes it my duty to hold out as a living symbol." And then he concludes, ironically, "It would truly have been worthwhile to fight for this powerful revolution if its new spirit should consist of showing consideration for the background of this or that leading figure, the Abstammung. I have bigger concerns than showing even momentary consideration for such questions of fact from a time gone by and overcome. No offense intended, Kurt Eisner." So I thought that was a nice example of how he reacted, and I was surprised even to find that in writing. And of course, the issue was that Eisner was not the only Jewish member in this revolution. I'll speak to this in a moment. What you see on the left, on the right bottom, is the site where Eisner was assassinated only about 3 months after he came to office. Well, in the meantime, he had actually called elections. His party, the Independent Social Democrats, had lost these elections in a very humiliating defeat. They only got 2.5%. He was on the way to the Bavarian parliament with his letter of resignation in his pocket when a young man, a 21-year-old young man, approached him from behind with a gun and shot him and killed him. It turns out that there was also a Jewish aspect in this assassination, not just in terms of the victim, but also the assassin himself. The assassin, Count Arco, was part of a long-term Bavarian aristocratic family on his father's side. On his mother's side, his mother was a née Oppenheim. So from a Jewish family, famous banking family, she had already been baptized, her parents had already been baptized, but this young right-wing nationalist wanted to join one of those new emerging ultra-right-wing movements, the Two-less Society. And they wouldn't let him because he wasn't Aryan enough for him. So one of the motifs, it may not be the only one, but one of the reasons he killed Eisner was to prove to them that he was worthy of belonging to this group. So I said already And I should say, even though Eisner lost the elections, there were over 100,000 people attending his funeral. It was the largest funeral Munich had ever seen, even larger than the kings who had died before him. Sorry, I just went too fast here. As I said before, there are quite a few important Jewish participants, both in the revolution of 1918, which then turned into two short-lived council, or as it's often translated into English, Soviet republics, in April of 1919. Some of the leaders, and in fact the main leaders, were Ernst Stoller, and this goes clockwise, who was a young but already known writer, expressionist writer. Gustav Landauer, again, intellectual, known for example, translations of Shakespeare, but also his own writings. He also was a very close friend of Martin Buber, the Jewish philosopher, who in fact visited him, Landauer, in Munich when he was part of Eisner's government. And Buber happened to be in Munich the day Eisner was assassinated. On his way home, he wrote down the whole episode, a huge Jewish tragedy. He was aware of the fact that the leaders of this revolution, even more so than in any other place, maybe with the exception of Budapest, but I would say Munich probably even more so, all the main leaders of this revolution and the republic, the Soviet republics, happened to be Jewish intellectuals mainly. The third one, Erich Mühsam, he was the incarnation of the Bohemian. Actually, he wrote about this himself. He explained what it means to be a bohem. He was the coffee house intellectual personified.
I'm going to take this away. Thank you again.
And he, just as Stoller and Landauer, became involved around Eisner, but then also in the Soviet Council. Now, the first Soviet Republic was more of kind of an anarchist group around Landauer and Stoller. It was brought down only after about a week. And the second Soviet Republic was now a communist Soviet Republic. At its head was Eugen Leviné. He was actually the only Russian Jew in this group. The whole thing, as you can imagine, ended very fast and tragically. These were all intellectuals who were not necessarily schooled politically and had also very little backing in the population. What happened then was a right-wing takeover. First, actually, it was a short period of social democrat, but then a right-wing takeover and a reactionary period in this government. And of course, this is the backdrop, the background, which we should not forget, the revolution, and the first time in German history that Jewish politicians come to the top of the state. The reaction was very fierce. Anti-Semitism took root in all of the major institutions in Munich in a very short time. So when I say major institutions, of course, the courts. If you look at the verdict against the assassin of Kurt Eisner, it is amazing to read the transcript of the trial, because it was not only his own defender, it was the prosecutor and the judge who thought Arco, the assassin, was the real patriot because he killed the socialist Eisner. Of course, they had to kill, I mean, it was clear he was the assassin. They had to convict him first to death sentence, then that was converted the same day to life sentence, and after a few years, he was released in 1924. But there were, and by the way, the judge was the same judge who would then preside over Hitler after he had tried to come to power in 1923 through the beer hall putsch, same judge who had the same very mild verdict against Hitler. The police, Munich's police chief, his name is Pöhner, became, and he's actually in the picture here to the right, with the strong man for many years of Bavaria's politics, prime minister and later state commissioner, von Kahr. Pöhner was one of the earliest Nazis in town. He marched together with Hitler in 1923, the beer hall putsch. By then he was no longer police, the head of police in Munich. But not only he, the head of the political division of the Munich police, later became an active Nazi and for a long time was Minister of Justice under Hitler after 1933. Politics, as I said, here we have the strong person, actually from a moderate party, the Catholic Center Party. He was a professional bureaucrat for many years, von Kahr. But the first act, one of the very first acts in politics, when he became prime minister, first in 1920, was that he tried to expel East European Jews from Bavaria. A few were expelled, but he did not succeed because of huge protests to expel as many as he wanted. But there were raids. And then he became a second time the strongman of Bavaria in 1923, and he tried it again in the first month. You can see in his unpublished memoirs how deeply anti-Semitic he thought, but more of a traditional, he was actually Protestant, of a traditional Christian kind of anti-Judaism than a racial anti-Semitic. He was not a Nazi, but clearly his politics were from the early hour on anti-Semitic. And finally, the church, and I already mentioned the strong person, one of the most powerful, maybe the most powerful person in Munich, the Archbishop and later Cardinal Faulhaber. And it's interesting because his diaries were just discovered a few years ago. And they're fascinating. Some of it is online now. Because the Jewish leaders, the Rabbi of Munich, often came to the Cardinal, complained about the anti-Semitism in town. And he thought, we know that from the notes the rabbi wrote down, that he had an open ear with the Cardinal. Now we know from his diary where he writes down, oh, the rabbi is here again. I can't do anything for him, and I won't do anything for him because the Jews are so wealthy they can help themselves. And that was his position also after 1933. So we have a situation in Munich in the early years of 1919 until Hitler's first attempt to come to power in 1923, where everybody speaks of a pogrom-like situation. Jews are beaten up on the streets. There is a film that is shown with much success in Berlin, Nathan the Wise. The film cannot be shown in Munich because the rising Nazi party threatens the cinema owners, and they back down. They don't want to have their movie theaters destroyed. The university refuses to appoint Jewish professors because they already have a Jew in chemistry. This was in the chemistry department. Richard Willstätter, who happened to be a Nobel Prize winner, and Willstätter resigned out of protest to this policy. He said, we want the best people, if they're Jewish or not, I don't even know, he says. But the university refused to do so. Of course, they wouldn't say openly that's the reason. Shortly, the Jews who felt threatened didn't have anywhere to go. Not to the police where you would go, not to the courts, not to the politicians, and not to the church. And that was the atmosphere between 1923, and I just stopped sharing for a moment, and between 1918 and 1923. It was an atmosphere of threat, of physical threat for many Jews in Munich, and it became clear, if you read the Jewish newspapers at the time, that the climate had changed dramatically. Munich used to be, before World War I, considered to be a liberal city. Berlin was considered to be the more Prussian and conservative place, certainly in the late 19th century and maybe still in the first years of the 20th century. Thomas Mann, the writer who lived in Munich and married actually into a Munich Jewish family, wrote this down very, very clearly. But he also wrote down something else. In June of 1923, he published an article in an American journal. He published this in English, where he called Munich the city of Hitler. That was before the Hitler putsch. That was in the summer of 1923. And that was kind of the atmosphere in Munich. I just wanted also to say again how much the Jewish community, it wasn't a huge community, there were about 11,000 Jews in Munich, compared to 170,000 in Berlin, or almost 30,000 in Frankfurt, 11,000 in Munich. It was a community that in parts was conservative and even monarchist. In other parts, it was moderate social democratic. Most of them did not, as we already saw, did not sanction the fact that, Jewish revolutionaries would be at the head of the state. Maybe I'll read that later. I have a really nice quote of the leader of the Orthodox Jewish community in Munich. The Jewish community in Munich they were very proud to be Bavarian, but they were also very Jewish in many ways. There was a strong Orthodox minority within the Jewish community. For example, the Feuchtwanger family, the writer Leon Feuchtwanger came from this family. His parents' generation, they were leaders of the Orthodox community, and they describe how they go to the Orthodox synagogue every Shabbat morning. And after that, they have a Stammtisch, their regular table at the Hofbräuhaus, the most Bavarian beer hall in Munich, where they have their coffee. Of course, they can't pay on Shabbat, so they write it up, and the next day they pay. That was kind of typical for Munich, where Jews brought their food to the beer gardens, which is allowed, and the beer, of course, is kosher. They were very much rooted in Munich, and did not like very much the fact that the Jewish revolutionaries come there. And of course, some of them blamed them for the anti-Semitism. In fact, there was one of them, the leader, as I said before, of the Orthodox community, Sigmund Frankl, who wrote an open letter to the Munich newspaper, which was published actually only later. And in this letter, he says, it's signed, on the eve of Passover of the Jewish year 5679, in April of 1919. It's addressed to Erich Mühsam, Dr. Wadler, Dr. Otto Neurath, Ernst Stoller, Gustav Landauer, and all the Jewish leaders of the revolution and the council, the republic. So he addressed them not as he said, not as a frightened capitalist worried about his property and possessions, but rather because I acknowledge with pride and out of inner religious conviction my membership in that community of faith to which you or your parents once belonged. He rejected any associations with the revolutionaries, and he concludes, our hands are clean of the horrors of chaos and of the misery and suffering that your politics must conjure up over Bavaria's future development. You alone and only you bear full responsibility for this. So this was kind of the atmosphere among Munich Jews. Just, we have nothing to do with them. Of course, there were so many reasons for the rise of radical right-wing extremism in Munich in 1919, 20, 21, which had nothing to do with Jewish revolutionaries, but they had a good, foil against which they could place themselves. And even in Mein Kampf, Hitler writes that this was a decisive episode when Eisner and the Jewish revolutionaries became powerful, that his political views were shaped. We cannot prove that, we don't know that, but it's definitely interesting how this happened. I just want to share my screen briefly again for the last 2 slides. So by November 1923, Hitler had become bold enough to stage a coup against Gustav von Kahr, the state commissioner, kind of a dictator almost of Bavaria at the time. He and his supporters came into this beer cellar and with their guns, and it's still unclear if they forced von Kahr to stand by Hitler and say, we're with you. Hitler wanted to have the Bavarian strong politicians with him, under him, or as they later claimed, they were forced basically with Hitler holding his gun against their heads, that they had to do it. In any case, the next morning, they decided they would go against Hitler. There was some bloodshed. The beer hall putsch was thrown down. In the next morning, Hitler himself fled outside of Munich. And as we all know, once he was caught, there was a trial with a very mild outcome. He served actually under a year in prison, which even shouldn't be called prison. It was a very comfortable place where you see him here writing his political manifesto, Mein Kampf. But what he learned from the years since he founded the National Socialist National Socialist Party was that the Jews actually are an easy target. He targeted them on November 9th, and that is another thing for November 9th in German history so important. November 9th, 1923, during the attempted beer hall putsch, Nazi hordes went into Jewish homes in Munich, looted them. Some Jews were taken out of their homes, were taken as hostages. If you read the reports of November 9th, 1923, some of them read like November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, 15 years later. And he felt and he knew anti-Semitism actually works. It works. Jews did not have the support in the city. They did not have the support by the Bavarian government. Actually, let me conclude by that. The only places that supported the Jews in Munich, or that were able to express support, were foreign consulates in Munich. Some of the Jews were Polish citizens. Actually, with all the anti-Semitism in Poland, Polish government tried to defend their citizens. The Austrian consul, they were mainly scared that, they would be deported to Austria because some of them came from Galicia, it used to be Austria. So the Austrians were very strong against these attempts in 1920 and 23 to deport Jews, mainly because they didn't want them, but whatever the reason was. And the Americans. So I did look quite extensively into the State Department files, and it is very interesting how this goes back and forth. Actually, it starts with American Jews, influential American Jews, writing to the Secretary of State, what is going on in Munich? They do this in 1920 and in 1923. There are pogroms in Germany, in Munich. They try to expel East European Jews from Germany. We want to know what's going on. The Secretary of State sends it to the ambassador in Berlin. The ambassador sends it to the consul general in Munich. And it's very interesting to see, yes, they support, of course, Jews should be free to, should not be persecuted, shouldn't be pogroms. But in many of the State Department's correspondence, you also see kind of anti-Semitism. But you know, the Jews, they were the revolutionaries. No wonder they go against the Jews now. And as we know, the State Department back then was definitely not free of anti-Semitism. So you have kind of a mixed signals in these letters, which are coming from the State Department. Okay, I think I'll stop here. There's, of course, much more to talk about, and I hope some of it I can answer in your questions.
Thank you, Michael, for that wonderful talk. I would just remind everyone who's watching, if you have questions, please put them into the chat. And while we're waiting for that, let me just begin by asking a question. There was, when we get to 1933, of course, the response of German Jewry, different streams had different responses. Of course, no one's happy with the situation, but they write directly to Hitler, and they write through the prism of their own politics and their own religious affiliation. And so, but that's sort of really at a national level. And when we tend to think of the Nazis as having come to power in Germany, we speak certainly outside of Germany, we speak rather generally about German Jewry per se. And I'm just wondering if we can sort of just, if we can drill down a little bit more on the specificity of Munich in relation to the rest of the community. And that is to say, since they are the first ones who really feel the brunt of the Nazis, do they have a different, is the rest of the Jewish community outside of Munich in Germany slower to appreciate what's going on? Do they need convincing? Are they more dismissive? Or is there no difference between the way the Munich Jews reacted? But, you know, with pogrom, I mean, everything changes once you cross that threshold with violence, of course. And they are met with violence, and there are break-ins and people are being beaten up and things like that. So how does the Munich Jewish response differ from the rest of the country before 33, you know, in the period that you're looking at?
Right. Well, the response was, I would say, more defensive just because the events were different. You didn't have the reports. I mean, yes, there were some reports, mainly later, like 1930 in Berlin, of riots against Jews coming out during the high holidays from the synagogues. But Munich was special. I think everybody agreed, and that's why the American State Department was worried about what's going on in Munich and not about in Berlin in the early 20s. So it might have been more defensive, but I think you mentioned a really important point. We can't talk about German Jewry as one entity. First of all, Bavarian Jews had a very distinctive identity as Bavarians. And I mentioned the Feuchtwanger family and how they went to the beer hall and all that. When they later immigrated, some of them came to Palestine in the 1930s. There was reports, oh my God, they speak Hebrew with such a Bavarian accent, not a German accent, Bavarian accent. And of course, before, when their relatives of Berlin come, they say, we can't even understand them. They speak Bavarian. So there was a Bavarian distinct identity, but there was also a distinct identity of many Orthodox, and again, they were a minority, but not such a small one, Orthodox Jews in Bavaria. Many of them still lived in smaller towns and even villages, with the Catholic Center Party, with a very conservative party, because they shared some values in terms of schooling, separate, you know, confessional schooling and so on. So the reactions were different in that respect, even within Bavaria. But I think in general, they were more defensive in Bavaria because of nobody could deny the prominence of Jewish participants in the revolution. So they are very defensive about that, which in a way makes sense. You know, the saying in Moscow, the Trotskys make the revolutions and the Bronsteins pay the price. So here it's the Eisners make the revolution, but the Frankls pay the price. In fact, that guy, Frankl, whom I just mentioned, the leader of Orthodox Jewry, he wrote that letter from which I quoted at the end, you know, we have nothing to do with those guys. They're you know, whose parents happen to be Jewish. He was beaten down the streets of Munich in 1923 in a tram, in a streetcar, together with his wife and his son. And he actually never really recovered from that. And he was a very prominent member of the middle class. He was the Kommerzienrat. He was in all of the local councils, and he was beaten down the streets. And you know, this is the same person who distanced himself publicly from the revolutionaries.
Well, we're still waiting for some questions, but most Jews in Germany would have voted Social Democrat. How did they feel? How did socialist Jews and strong supporters of the Social Democrats feel about Eisner?
Yeah,
maybe not more some of the not about the sort of more radical revolutionaries, but were any of them happy about the fact that there had been a Minister President Eisner?
So great question. So the Social Democrats were really split since the independent Social Democrats rose in the middle of World War I with the goal to end the war. They remained for a few years as an independent social democratic party, more to the left of what's called the majority Social Democrats. So those who were in the independent ones, and there were some Jews in Munich too, of course, were supporters of Eisner. But then there were those who were in the majority Social Democrat, even in the Munich City Council. And they were just like their non-Jewish Social Democratic colleagues. They were against Eisner. They were against the independent Social Democrats, but not in a radical way. At some point, the two parties reunited again. But we do find, and that is often overlooked, a high number of Jews who fought, often as part of the majority Social Democrats, against the radical Soviet republics. They fought. I mean, they didn't just fight with words. They fought with weapons against it. And so there were many Jews fighting Jews in these days, of course. I mean, fighting, and as I said, the Revolution of November 1918 was without any bloodshed. But in April of 1919, there was some bloodshed in Munich. And when it was suppressed from more right-wing forces, the end of April, early May of 1919, there was even more bloodshed. And Jews were definitely on both sides.
Okay. Anyone want to help? Throw in some questions?
I see hands up. I mean,
you do. I don't.
There are several questions in the chat, John. I'm sorry. I guess you're not seeing them. So
No, they're not here. I'm sorry.
I don't see them either.
Okay, so I'm going to just I'll start reading them.
Okay, I apologize to everyone. I'm looking at the chat and they aren't here on mine. So I'm sorry about that.
I don't know how they're being sent, so I'm sorry too. Michael, thank you too. I want to add my thanks. It was really very informative. So, well, first, even before there was a question, there was a comment from Bettina Kaplan who said, I've heard of you as I'm the co-founder of the Jewish descendants of the Jewish community of Augsburg. And she was very much looking forward to your talk, which she has now heard. Then there was a question, how did Kurt Geisner become prime minister? Was he elected, appointed? It wasn't really clear.
Thank you. Yeah, and I was obviously so short with the actual events of the revolution. I apologize for that. I just wanted to dedicate most to the theme of the topic, theme of the talk. Eisner was not elected. Well, he was elected, but by the councils of workers, soldiers, and farmers or peasants. So these were councils which were revolutionary councils formed at the time, November 1918. Eisner had already gained a reputation. Earlier in 1918, he was the leader of a strike against in ammunition factories, again, in order to end the war. He was, as a result of that, imprisoned. Interestingly enough, he was set free from prison in order to be able to become a candidate for the elections to the Bavarian Diet, still in 1918. So he was not elected in any kind of nationwide elections. He rose to immediate popularity in this moment. And in fact, it's a long story. I try to make it very short. What happened on November 7th is that there were two public demonstrations on the Theresienwiese in Munich, which is famous because that's the location where once a year there's the Oktoberfest. It's a big meadow. And there was this leader of the majority Social Democrats, much larger party. And after they ended their demonstration, November 7th, they went home. And Eisner and his supporters did not go home. They marched on. They marched to the barracks where the soldiers were and brought the soldiers out. And while the majority Social Democrats were in their beds sleeping, they started the revolution. And they both had their demonstrations next to each other then. So it was a very spontaneous way. But it seems that he actually had, for a moment, pretty broad support from the variety of strata of the Bavarian population, including soldiers, workers, and important in Bavaria, which was still a very rural state, the peasants, that one of the main leaders of the peasant movement or party actually aligned with Eisner. That was very important. But then in the actual elections, 2 months later in January, it was also times of chaos in these months, all over Germany and Europe still. His party did not do well.
Okay, great. Let's see. Then there was a question, could you please identify the other persons around Hitler in the photo you showed of Hitler sitting down?
Well, the only one I remember from the photo actually was Rudolf Hess, who was with him here. And but and I don't want to go back now to the slides, but what I can say, and that's why the question is really important, Munich, it's very hard. I'm often asked, why did Munich become this hotbed of anti-Semitism? Why did Munich become the center of, where the Nazi party rose? And for Hitler, it was more than just a town, a city where he happened to be. He says, for us, Munich, it is the laboratory. He says, it is what Mecca is to Islam and Moscow to communism. That's Munich to the Nazi movement. And there are probably lots of explanations, but one is that really at this time, there was a conglomeration of people in Munich who just came there mainly after World War I. Some, like Hitler, had been there before. And if you look at the core of the Nazi movement, many of them were there at the very first moment. Hitler, I mentioned Rudolf Hess, who came pretty early. Rosenberg, the main ideologue of the party. Goering was a student in Munich, was there very early. And of course, that's a little later, but Heinrich Himmler was from Munich. What is interesting is that Hitler and the Nazis always slandered these Jewish revolutionaries as foreigners. Now, even if you, for a moment, don't brand Eisner as a Galician, but a Prussian, that's bad enough. That's what they meant by foreigners, non-Bavarians. But they were all Germans. Eisner was from Berlin. Landauer was from Karlsruhe. Mühsam was born in Lübeck and grew up in Berlin. And they were Germans, but not from Berlin, from Bavaria. But so were the Nazis. Hitler himself, he was Austrian. Goering was not from Bavaria. Rosenberg was a Baltic German, and even if you hear him speak, he has that strong Baltic, almost Russian accent in his German. So nobody talked about that they themselves were also foreigners to Bavaria.
Okay, great. We had a question here. Is Pacelli's role in Munich at this time chronicled in the Vatican archives? There seems to be a clear pattern developing here.
Yes, I think there is. I didn't try, and I have not been to the Vatican archives, but what you find, I did go to the, the Archbishop's archives in Munich. And there's lots of correspondences there, but also lots of Pacelli's correspondence from his Munich time is now published online. And there is a clear, again, not in any way Nazi-like racist anti-Semitism, certainly not, but a lot of traditional anti-Jewish sentiment in or between the lines, both in Pacelli, and then he actually had to flee Munich, or he decided to flee Munich for a while during the revolution because he felt threatened. And his deputy continues in even stronger terms against, they're especially upset about the East European Jewish women. Some of them were East European, but some of them were just Jewish women. So that is like everything which they abhor. They're Jewish, they're East European, and they're women. And they now control, they sit, and now we're talking about the Soviet Council, the Council Republic of 1919. They often sit in front of, in the office to decide who can go in to speak to the new rulers of Bavaria. And these are women. And that is shocking for Pacelli and for his deputy, and of course for the Archbishop. The Archbishop, and then later became Cardinal, is not as radical, but there's interesting, for example, one document while Eisner was prime minister, say, how will and to make it very clear, how can a Jew have the authority as if he were a Christian ruling over the Christian people of Bavaria? How can a Jew have the authority?
Okay.
More questions?
Yes, there are. Is it possible to separate out the anti-Judaism from the anti-left politics at this early 20s period? Does the politics precipitate the anti-Semitism?
You said the anti-socialist and or anti-left and anti-Jew. Well, they go very much hand in hand, and the best example is the stab in the back legend or myth, the Dolchstoßlegende, according to which Germany lost the war not because of their military defeat, but because of the enemies in its midst, Jews and socialists. And here's another point which I didn't stress enough in my talk. There were some figures of Jewish background who very much contributed to the anti-Semitic thought and to this legend, to this myth on the right. I already mentioned, of course, the assassin of Eisner, but another figure, and I think he was kind of the most, for me, the most fascinating figure I discovered in this research, was a person called Paul Nicholas Kossmann. He was born to a Jewish family, moved to Munich before World War I, was the editor of a very important cultural magazine, the Süddeutsche Monatshefte, which actually was pretty liberal before World War I, but then turned very right-wing during World War I. He converted to Christianity. He became, I think, a very devout Catholic. He was just very conservative, not, Nazi. Like of course, he couldn't be because he wasn't Aryan, but he was, in what I saw, one of the handful of most influential figures in Munich after World War I. He was the main editor, even if not in name, but he was, of the most important daily newspaper in Munich. So like, the Washington Post, the New York Times of Munich, the Münchner Neueste Nachrichten, which he turned from a liberal into a right-wing paper. And he still edited this other journal, Süddeutsche Monatshefte, in which he gave a lot of place to the spread of the stab in the back legend. Now, when Hitler came to power, I'm just jumping here because it's an interesting biography. Obviously, after 1933, his role was over. He also did not like Hitler. He was very right-wing nationalist, but not a Nazi. And he tragically, and he was brought to Theresienstadt in the 40s and died there, was killed there, and was buried in a Jewish burial. This person who became this devout Catholic, and I would say one of the biggest, in that case, I'm very careful with this expression of Jewish self-hatred, but if you read his articles, and he was a very intelligent, smart intellectual, but if you read it, he could not overcome this Jewish self-hatred. And then he ended as a Jew in Theresienstadt. A fascinating biography, really little known, even in Munich today. Hardly anyone remembers his name, but he was in the midst of all of it in the early 1920s.
Great. We have a handful more, so let's see if we can go a little longer. So this person says, thank you for an important and thought-provoking talk. Did you come across cases in which the local community in Munich showed support of the Jews after the 1923 pogrom?
If the local Jewish community showed support to whom?
Did you come across cases in which the local community in Munich showed support of the Jews after
the local, like the city? And yes, right. Actually, the years after 1923 were calmer for a while, only for a while. And you see that the mayor and the police, actually, I mean, after the Hitler putsch, you see that the police tries to become more mainstream, less right-wing than before. The courts remain more or less the same. Local politics, I would say, backs the Jews. When this guy Frankel is beaten up in the streets, the newspapers are clearly condemning these acts and other acts like that. It is a short period between 1924 and maybe 29, which is calmer than the time before or after.
Okay. Thinking beyond Germany to somewhat parallel contexts, do you see similarities between the mix of factors that you described here and those in, say, Vienna or Warsaw in a given moment from the late 19th century to the interwar years? Put differently, while this is a local story, is it also a singularly German one?
Yes. There are similarities. The differences is these are really very large, substantial Jewish communities of like 200,000 people, of a very substantial percentage of the city population. In Munich, it's a very small group of, as I said, about 11,000 people, about 1% of the population, but at the same time, with such a strong public moment in 1918-19 with this revolutionary leadership. So there are differences, but sure, I would say overall this is a phenomenon after World War I, which we see the rise of anti-Semitism and of physical threats all over Central Europe.
And this viewer asked, what was the position of the Catholic Center during this early period?
So the Catholic Center Party, that's really interesting, had both elements of those who defended Jews and Judaism because they remembered from the time of Bismarck, the 1870s, that a Protestant majority in the German Reich, German level, fought against Catholics, and they could identify in some way with Jews also being attacked. So you have that, especially defending Jewish religious rights. And Professor Efra knows a lot about this. I think he's working a lot on this now. Like, for example, Shrita, the kosher slaughtering. It was the Catholic Center Party here's an interesting point about Bavaria. In 1930, the Nazi Party wants to outlaw kosher slaughtering in Bavaria, only in Bavaria. They don't have a majority in the Bavarian parliament. Whom do they get as an ally? The Social Democrats, who, for supposedly, animal protection reasons, go along in this question with the Nazi Party against the Catholic Center Party. And then there's the other question. There's very open support from the Orthodox Jewish parts of the community for the Catholic Center Party because they are on the same page in terms of schools and other questions. But the majority, but there is also, and I just want to say, there's also an anti-Semitic stream within the Center Party. And that's where somebody like Gustav von Kahr comes from, even though he's not Catholic, but he's close to the Center Party. And one last thought, maybe, if you look at the election results of the Nazi Party, now we're in the early 30s already, but Munich is not a major success story in terms of their votes. In all of Bavaria, Nazi successes are much less than in many other German regions and states. Why? Because the strong party is always the Bavarian Center Party, and they don't lose that much support. In the areas where you have a Protestant majority in Bavaria, parts of Franconia, that's like Nuremberg, that's where the Nazis are much stronger.
Okay, we've got 3 more and then we will stop. What other minorities existed at the time in Germany? Why pick on the Jews?
Well, because honestly, there weren't that many other minorities. I mean, definitely not religious minorities. There was a tiniest Muslim community, mainly in Berlin, which was much smaller even than the Jewish one. And and there weren't that many immigrants most of the immigrants were Jews, were East European Jews. So Jews, in a way, were the minority, and that had been so for centuries, in a way, that Jews were the classical minority.
In terms of World War I, how were Jews treated after serving? Did that have any consequence for their daily lives, or were they just treated with disdain?
Well, I want to make clear, and I'm sure I talked about anti-Semitism in this talk, they weren't always treated with disdain. There was still, in the 1920s, a mixture where they could rise to prominent positions, where they were prominent definitely in the middle class of the major cities, and where some of them thought, there was these pogroms and there's pogroms, but it will pass. So I would just say that's important to keep in mind. And sorry, and the question was about were they always treated with disdain? Is that
right? That was.
So I think we just have to keep that in mind, even though I concentrated mainly on that. There were, of course, also moments in the lives of all Bavarian or German Jews where they thought, these are marginal phenomena, but we're making it into society. That we could see it as such too. But I think overall, much less than let's say, a generation earlier, where especially violent anti-Semitism around 1900 or 1910 was much less pronounced than in the 1920s.
Okay. How did Bavaria come to be called a Soviet republic?
Right, so that's a good question, and I'm struggling now actually what to use for the translation of my book into English. The German term is Räterepublik, and that is a council republic. And council is the Soviet word, so I mean the Russian word Soviet means council. So the Soviet Republic is a council republic. These councils were often constructed after the Russian example. They were not called Soviets in German, but the English translation, even in the contemporary documents, was often Soviet. And I'm now trying to find out what to use in translation to call it Council's Republic or Soviet Republic. But Soviet Republic might have a slight, negative and propagandistic sound. So that's a question I'm just thinking about now, and I don't have a clear answer, but that's why it became, so Soviet means council.
Great. And so for our last question, Faulhaber, if I said that right, Faulhaber is often raised today as a pillar of anti-Nazi posture. My sense is that this is not an accurate picture of him. This is a former Münchner.
Yeah, it's true. Faulhaber, who, by the way, was a cardinal over many different periods. Weimar, he started still during the war in Imperial Germany, and then Weimar and Nazi, and he died in the 50s. So he was cardinal over all these periods in Munich, and kind of a local hero even until today. And ironically, by the way, the street in which Eisner was assassinated is today called the Cardinal Faulhaber Straße. I don't think Eisner would have liked that. He was, in some ways, very courageous to speak out against the Nazis. Like there were these sermons he gave in December of 1933, where he defended, for example, the Old Testament against an Aryanizing theology. And he held the Old Testament in high esteem. And he meant the Jews of the Old Testament, but he did not mean, he made this very explicit, the Jews of his own day. He did not say one single word to protect the Jews of 1933, or for that matter, of 1923. Look, I've tried to look at his diaries, and I tried to look at his sermons and published writings, and I came to the conclusion that it is a very traditional Catholic anti-Judaism which he shared, which is based on the fact that they don't see the truth of Christianity. The moment they converted, he protected them. He protected the Judaism of the Old Testament. It was this kind of traditional anti-Judaism. And when they were physically attacked, not after 33, but before 33, he occasionally would say that he disagreed, very, very mildly. After 33, he remained pretty quiet.
Thank you. John?
I would just say that there was a question before about the photo in Landsberg, in the prison where Hitler was. One of the people there, and it's a contrast to Faulhaber, was a priest whose last name was Stempfler. And yeah, Stempfler actually helped him with the writing of Mein Kampf. And so he belonged to the more radical wing than, say, someone like Faulhaber. He would have also agreed with the racist tenor of things as well. Anyway, Michael, thank you very much for really a wonderful and stimulating talk. And I can see by the looks on people's faces, they were engrossed and engaged, and which is nothing less than I would have expected from you. It's another triumphant presentation. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and please make sure you check in to our website, the Center for Jewish Studies at UC Berkeley, for forthcoming events. And with that, this was this year's 2021 Pell Lecture, and I want to thank Michael Brenner for presenting it to us. Thank you.
And it's nice to see some familiar faces or names among the audience.
Indeed.
Great.
Okay, take care, everyone.